My first job in San Francisco was at Bank of America, in their headquarters, the Clock Tower building. The year was 1996, and this is the story of how my boss, one night, stole my car and disappeared forever. 1996 is a long time ago. Parts of this story go back even further than that, so you can expect a mistake in accuracy once in a while, and I'll try to point them out as they occur. Memories from that time are spotty and mislabeled. They're all analog. This is just to say that while the spirit of the story is true and authentic, it's only about 95% real. I came to San Francisco with no direction, for a fresh start, but it was a time in my life when no direction felt pretty good. A year before arriving in San Francisco, I'd been living in Miami, finishing up an MFA program at the university there. When I got to Miami in 1993, the ultimate goal was to become a professor. I had all the romantic notions too. Tweed jackets with elbow patches, hurrying through courtyards, tenure track, sabbaticals, a new novel every 3 years. But that goal had been dashed during my second year in the program, when I had to teach Creative Writing 101 to a class full of undergrads. I received a stipend, and teaching was part of the assistantship agreement. And the assistantship agreement made attending the overpriced school possible. My experience as a creative writing instructor from the beginning was embarrassing and awkward. One day, I even lashed out, calling the whole class lame. I felt bad about that, and it taught me something very valuable. Teaching is so difficult because it is largely thankless, which means that, even at the highest level, job satisfaction comes from the students, from reveling in their accomplishments. And with that epiphany, I knew, by the end of the semester, that I'd never be a professor. I did put the effort in. I did take teaching seriously. A few students even evolved as writers. And don't get me wrong, this is pretty magical to behold. You see it in their eyes as much as their work. There's an ignition. So I saw it, and I was pleased to be involved. But I was pleased because that was the job. I wasn't excited for the students at all. And I knew that if I didn't draw joy from that, the next 40 years were going to be a tough row to hoe. So like I was saying, I arrived in San Francisco with no purpose, no direction, no prospects. And any panic over any of that, if it existed at all, was buried deep down. There was plenty to keep the mind occupied. It was my first time in California, first time living in a city with trams and subway cars. What struck me, and I think I noticed it my first day there, was how strangers seemed to greet each other. That was new. Where I grew up, when you exchanged glances in the street, it was usually an accident. You weren't supposed to do that. If you did, the response would be, "What the fuck do you want?" Or, "What? You want to start something?" In California, or this part of it at least, it wasn't like that. Strangers looked at one another with a curiosity that was, doubtless, superficial, but still a vast improvement over what I was used to. So that was weird, and it took a while for me to figure out how to smile back. I moved to San Francisco because I'd been in a rut. For one thing, well, I mentioned how my dreams of being a professor were shot. For another, in January of 1996, months after getting my degree, I went out for some cigarettes, fleeing Miami in the middle of the night, retreating to the town of my birth in Connecticut. The reason that happened is actually a whole other story, but I'm not going to get into it here. My childhood friend, Adam, was alarmed that I was suddenly back in our old neighborhood. "You should come out here," he said. "San Francisco's a real city." Now, it's important to understand what Adam was saying. Certainly, San Francisco was a real city, and some say it still is, but in that instant, he was also busting my balls. Adam was comparing it to Miami Beach. He had taken me at my word that Miami Beach was like Greenwich Village, and that had been enough to convince him to take the long bus ride from San Francisco to Miami 2 years prior. Adam had spent time in the real Greenwich Village, more time than me, and for him, Miami never took. It even gave him boils, like he was allergic to it, and after a few months, he went back to San Francisco. Adam's invitation came a couple of months after he had gotten married at a small Elvis chapel in Las Vegas, and Natalie, his new wife, who I hadn't met yet, was well into her first trimester of pregnancy. Right after Adam suggested I move to San Francisco, I phoned my old roommate from college, Roderick. Like me, Roderick, at present, found himself back in Connecticut, but he had lived out west for a little while already. So I figured he could provide me with some insight and advice. Back then, the world felt bigger than it does today, and the phrase moving to California had a mystical quality about it. And Roderick told me that he was moving to San Francisco in 2 weeks. A caravan, he and his friend Mel, and I was welcome to join them. This was insanely fortuitous, and I took him up on his offer. The road trip across the country in April of 1996 took 3 days. It was uneventful, so memories are dim. I remember an exit ramp in Chicago, the speed limits of Wyoming, and the mountains of Utah. We all parted ways after crossing into San Francisco. Roderick and I didn't see much of one another after that, and I never saw Mel again. The AAA map led my 1987 Acura Integra straight to Adam and Natalie's apartment. And that reminds me, I mentioned a couple minutes ago that we were bound to encounter inaccuracies, and that I'd acknowledge it when possible. So here's one. In my first San Francisco story, I said the Acura Integra was a 1990. That was wrong. It was, I've since learned, a 1987. Adam and Natalie were great. Adam, shortly after my arrival, led me up to the top of Twin Peaks. From the summit, I got a pretty spectacular view of my new city. I slept on a couch in the workspace of their live workspace in the city's south of Market neighborhood. There was a television there too, and a motorcycle, and a pit bull named Dot, who had been diagnosed with PTSD. It was a bit like living in a garage, but that wasn't a bad thing. It afforded me some privacy too. I did my best not to be a burden, to be a force of good. I said, from here on in, I'll walk and clean up after Dot. I wanted to help with the rent too, so I went in search of a job as soon as possible. Bank of America was not a company I had ever heard of. They weren't on the East Coast yet, or if they were, I'd never seen one. The job was to provide support to Bank of America customers who had enrolled in their new home banking program. This was a time and money-saving service that allowed one to pay bills electronically. Say goodbye to paper cuts and costly stamps. Step into the future of banking. All it takes is a Windows PC and Netscape Navigator. Bank of America and competitor Wells Fargo were the only banks offering online bill pay at the time, and if I remember correctly, it was only available to customers in California. On the 4th floor, we provided tech support to confused and/or angry customers. Today, much of that job would be accomplished through email and bots. But back then, email was a new imposter. Bots, that wasn't something I'd even heard of yet. So people talked on the phone. We were an important cog in the home banking machine because it was a new technology for everyone. The bank, the software designers, the browser companies, the city too. It was early in the internet. AOL were still giants, and participating customers were guinea pigs, or, as they might be called today, the unwitting beta testers of a new fintech tool. Glitches were expected, and mistakes could be costly. Payments got lost, and this was bad for credit scores. Sometimes it resulted in foreclosures. Explaining to customers that Bank of America would take care of it and that they wouldn't lose their home was part of the job. The 4th floor was a nice space as far as offices go, and we occupied all of it. It was a sprawling open plan, carpeted, decent lighting, a great view of the adjacent patch of city out the window. There were cubicles everywhere, and big screens that showed the number of people on hold. The job was just fine, and I loved working swing shift. A lot of late nights back then. And since so many customers were confused, angry, or both, the time flew right by. You'd pick up the phone, say, "Hello, valuable home banking customer. How may I help you?" And after that, anything could happen. The floor supervisor was Ken. Ken, in the interest of full disclosure, is not his real name. I can't recall what it really was, and there's no way for me to find out. At a minimum, That's how you can be sure this story has a happy ending. I don't harbor resentments. If I did, I'm sure I'd remember his actual name. To the coworkers who found him attractive, and many of those who did not, he looked exactly like a Ken doll with a modicum of ethnicity, so that's why I call him Ken. Ken generated reports and acted as a kind of cheerleader for the floor, and I do not mean that pejoratively. This was a high-stress job. I'd seen executives weeping on occasion. Cheerleaders help. So Ken wasn't a bad guy, just not the sort of person I'd generally spend time with. I painted people with a broad brush back then, and Ken was a little too all-American for me. Enjoyed cocaine, dance clubs, and the Niners, all things I avoided. The only concretely negative thing I could say about Ken, he had this annoying habit of seagulling. Seagulling I remember to be a restaurant term. As a waiter in New Haven, Connecticut, you'd always be running between the kitchen and the dining room, and if you were hungry, you might seagull down on a patron's entree before serving it up. Something he or she wouldn't notice, like one of 50 fried clam strips heaped over a plate. Speaking of food, one thing about me, all my life, I've loved pizza. In San Francisco, at work, I'd order pizza from North Beach. Couch surfing at Adam and Natalie's, I'd get it up the street at Pizza Love. A footnote here. Pizza Love went out of business 2 months after I got my own place. And Adam and Natalie thought it was the result of Pizza Love losing my business. Without you, one of them said, they'd have gone under much sooner. Since I grew up in Connecticut, I thought all pizza, no matter where it came from, was, at a minimum, good. I discovered in San Francisco that good pizza was an East Coast phenomenon. Good pizza in San Francisco was rare back then, but once you'd adjusted your standards down, it was all right. What was also indicative of this time and space was that, at the time, the concept of food delivery was novel, or at least it was to me. When I was a youth, it didn't exist. Then it existed only with pizza, so I had no notion that it could go further than that. Not until I was introduced to Pink Dot in Los Angeles a few years later. This is all to say that I could have been ordering burritos all along, and if I had done that, this story wouldn't have ever happened. You see, whenever I ordered pizza at work, Ken would come over to my cubicle. It was pretty automatic, like he had a sixth sense. Ken had a seagulling technique that was blunt and effective, one he always used. He would simply wait until I was on the phone with a customer. It was never a fair fight. Many phone calls required focus and patience. There were technological hurdles, and the people on the phone were usually at their worst. Ken, therefore, didn't have to be very slick. He'd sort of gesture to the pizza non-committally with his chin. I'd shake my head, as if to say no. Then he'd nod and walk off with a slice. I was young, and my ability to multitask was better than it is today, but it was never that good. Still, I didn't get the sense that Ken seagulled with malicious intent. He could have been hungry, even though he didn't dress like he was hungry. And he held me in pretty high esteem. I had a good voice for talking people down, and that was something he appreciated as a supervisor. But more importantly, Ken had developed an odd fascination with my car. As I mentioned, my car was an Acura Integra, and while it's hard to imagine anyone fetishizing such a car, it did, in Ken's defense, look kinda mean. This was the car that had gotten me to Miami in the summer of '93, where I'd eventually learned that I would never ever be a professor. The Integra had gotten its makeover in Florida. The first part of the transformation was tinting the windows, a common practical decision when living that close to the equator. The thing that made the car so distinctive? It was the paint job. I come from a long line of people from the Northeast who move down to Florida once they reach a certain age. So whenever family came to visit from Connecticut, we'd all converge on my grandparents' retirement community just up the coast. During one of those visits, my dad noticed a little rust. My mother suggested a paint job. My grandfather said paint jobs were cheap around here. I didn't care about the rust and never enjoyed cars or driving too much, except for that one car. That was fun. I viewed cars mostly as a conveyance, which explains why, by then, I'd already killed 2 cars through sheer neglect. But my parents offered to pay for the paint job. and I can't say that I was ever thrilled driving around in a gold-colored car. Parenthetically, it is a credit to my parents that I had such a bourgeois upbringing, he an upholsterer, she a public school teacher. The car was painted a kind of blue, as dark as the man at the body shop recommended going, given the state's proximity to the sun. On that note, he said, "It's a good idea to wax it. Wait a few weeks. It'll preserve the coat's vibrancy." By now I'd moved from Miami proper to a studio apartment on South Beach. South Beach, Miami, Florida was affordable back then, even a block from the ocean. This was before Will Smith wrote that song about it, which, I'm convinced, is the reason the place got too expensive and increasingly boring. Anyway, there was a little parking lot attached to the building where I lived, and one morning, a few weeks after getting the paint job up the coast, I got up around 10 and waxed the car, as I was advised to do. It was a hot, sunny day, like they all were, and after I finished applying the wax, which was a paste, I made a mental note that I should buff it out in a couple hours. Memories here are sketchy, but I know that somebody dropped by with LSD, and I don't remember who it was. Even though I was eating much less LSD at that time than I was in my teens, it could have been anybody, really. LSD wasn't so exotic back then, and for all I know, maybe it isn't all that exotic now. The LSD is why I didn't get back to the car until the next day, and while I busied myself, staring at beach sand most likely, the wax had cooked under the hot sun. I couldn't even do any buffing at that point. It had seeped into the paint, permanently altering the color and texture of the car. The finish was now matte, and the color was a two-tone, Arctic blue and powder burn. Between the tinted windows and the paint job, it looked like something out of the Road Warrior. So that was the car that Ken fell in love with. And Ken would keep asking me to take it for a ride. And whenever he'd ask, I'd say no, or ask him why first, and then say no. On this particular day, which was August 29, 1996, the 10-year anniversary of another unfortunate incident involving me and a car, I wanted to honor the anniversary with pizza from North Beach. Nothing very out of the ordinary there, but I wanted the whole pie. And I was convinced that Ken would, inevitably, seagull in and poach a slice. To prevent that, I opted to make it Ken's lucky day. When the pizza came, I called Ken over and tossed him the keys. He nodded seriously, as if a sacred trust had just been established. Ken turned and crossed the room. I saw the back of his head disappear out the door. And that's how Ken's tenure at Bank of America concluded. Nobody there would ever see him again. Not that I knew it at the time. All I knew was the joy of eating in peace. Over the course of a half hour, I worked my way through the entire pizza. My first call after the last slice went long. The man on the other end was filled with regret. "I am feeling very overwhelmed. Do you think you can talk me down?" When that call concluded, I saw that an hour had gone by since I tossed Ken the keys. I asked around if anybody'd seen him, but nobody knew anything. I didn't really sweat that and continued taking calls. People were excited about home banking, and the queue for customer support always got longer. Once 2 hours had gone by, I began to worry. I wasn't sure what to do. It goes without saying that cell phones were only in a few cars back then, and it also goes without saying that my car wasn't one of them. I phoned the police on someone's recommendation. There must have been an accident. The police took down the information, said to call back in 30 minutes. While waiting, I kept coworkers abreast of the situation. And that it would happen today of all days, I said, on the 10-year anniversary of my most gruesome auto accident. So 30 minutes later, after I'd learned there were no incidents fitting a car of that description, I told the officer that I ought to report it stolen. The officer said someone would be by in an hour to take down a statement. I was pleased to hear that. It meant that I wouldn't have to wait around after my shift. My coworker, Mary, who I'd been dating for about a week, joined me downstairs for a cigarette. Mary had been doing some investigating of her own and suggested we talk to Jasmine after the break. Jasmine and Ken had dated, and though they were no longer a thing, she might know something we didn't. The police got there pretty quickly. Mary and I were still downstairs. I hadn't even finished my cigarette. The officer, after I filled him in on the situation, said that he couldn't actually report it stolen. Not enough time had passed, and I couldn't get upset about it. It made complete sense. I'd given Ken the keys. I had technically lent him the car. The policeman said it'd be 24 hours before a report could be filed. He also said it was bad timing, this happening right before Labor Day weekend. The department, or precinct, or whatever it was called, would be operating as a skeleton crew until Tuesday. After the officer left, Mary and I went and found Jasmine. She agreed that it was quite odd that Ken hadn't returned. Still, she couldn't imagine that he'd stolen my car. He'd always treated her decently. And he was floor supervisor. It didn't make any sense. A bank boss stealing a car. There had to be some other more reasonable explanation. I didn't take many calls after that. Nobody did. The floor was buzzing with intrigue. Everybody wanted to talk about Ken. Who was this mysterious hire really? How was he entrusted with a supervisory role? Surely background checks were standard, weren't they? One coworker even said he'd ask his husband, a lawyer, whether I had a case against the bank. The plan that night had been to follow Mary over to her place in the Sunset District. Instead, we ended up in a seedy motel close to work. The sign on the door read, "Friendly service, overnights only." I can't say why we stayed in that flop house. It was probably because I was rattled, feeling some need to stay in close proximity to the scene of the crime. Plus, the Sunset, where Mary lived, was kind of out there. On top of that, the next day, Saturday morning, I was signing a lease. My new apartment was in the Mission District, and like the flophouse, much closer to work than Mary's place. The past week, irrespective of the stolen vehicle, had been a whirlwind. Before that night at the flophouse, which was the day after I slept at Mary's apartment for the first time, I had been house-sitting for Michael Jackson's stage manager. His place was up on Nob Hill, which was very classy back then and probably still is. The house-sitting gig had gone on for several days. It had begun the day I moved out of Adam and Natalie's. So 10 a.m. Saturday morning, I was meeting the landlord, signing the lease, and getting the keys. Anything can happen, but probably won't. That's how I'd describe the Mission District back then. My place was on the ground floor, behind the garage in a raised ranch, in what was called an in-law apartment. It had a bedroom, an efficiency kitchen, and a good-sized living room. There was one window, and it had bars on it, but the place got plenty of light, because sliding glass doors in the kitchen led to a delightful patio. The patio, which even contained a lemon tree, served as a great common area for everyone. Upstairs there were 3 bedrooms, always with 2 or 3 tenants, everyone more or less my age. I always called the upstairs Jill's place, because Jill was the only one who always lived there. Over the course of my occupancy downstairs, Gary lived there, Mark lived there, Felice lived there, Kaylee lived there, as did a couple of other people whose faces and names I can't remember. Adam had lived up there once too, long before I moved to San Francisco, and he's how I met Jill. Jill was one of those people who derive satisfaction from helping others, and she certainly helped me. Jill had spoken to the landlord and convinced him to let me rent the apartment downstairs. Jill is also the reason I got to house sit for Michael Jackson's stage manager. I read on Facebook that Jill died about 5 years ago. It made me real sad. After signing the lease with my landlord departed, I looked around my new place. That was the moment I realized that my entire estate was now, more or less, reduced to the clothes on my back. Since I was between homes for more than a week, I'd put my possessions in the trunk of the car. And since there was nothing much of value, just clothes, record albums, and a bunch of old notebooks, I left it all there. Losing the notebooks sucked, but it didn't send me into a funk or anything. I'd only been in San Francisco since April, and the city still felt like a new toy. Resigned to a deeper shade of minimalism, I went upstairs to Jill's. I told her what had happened with Ken in the car, and then used her phone to report it stolen. The switchboard operator gave me a case number. She said that the entire department would do its best. Oh shit. I was just now struck by an inconsistency in the narrative. I said that might happen, and it has. There's a logical problem with the San Francisco story that came before this one. In the last story, I said that after Dot the dog assaulted Cranky Frankie, I drove her to Steve Co's in my car. That couldn't have been the way it went. The situation with Cranky Frankie occurred a week or so after I moved in. In other words, after the car was stolen. Now, I can't say for sure how I got her out of the neighborhood. I would never have dared use public transportation. Dot was a crazy pit bull with PTSD. I must have borrowed Mary's car. Oh, and if everything I just said sounds totally random and makes no sense, ignore it. It's not important to this story, but it did need to be said. Rent at my new place was $600 a month, and though numerous acquaintances called me a rube for paying so much, I was extremely happy to have my own place. It had been nearly a year since I left Miami, and 2 years since my studio apartment there. That was the last time I'd lived alone. On top of that, I knew the score. Right after arriving in San Francisco, when I was couch surfing in Adam and Natalie's, the three of us had decided to find a bigger place and continue living together. 3 salaries makes paying the rent easier. Plus, we all got along. That didn't work out though. Vacancy, citywide, had dropped below 1%. We'd go to a showing only to find hundreds of people there, camped out on the lawn. The competition was fierce. None of us had ever seen anything like it. Even Natalie, who'd been living in San Francisco for a long time. While waiting in line, it was not unusual to hear potential tenants dangling stock options in front of landlords. The tech bubble was really gathering steam at that time, and this was ground zero. After signing the lease and calling the cops, and talking to Jill for a while longer, I returned to my new apartment. Mary came by shortly thereafter, and we went and picked up a mattress and box spring. That night, a couple blocks away, on the side of the road, on York or Bryant Street, I found a chair that, for some reason, plugged into a wall socket, but did nothing. Then, minutes later, Mary spotted a huge mid-century tanker desk. The thing weighed a ton, but with Mary's help, I got it home. On Sunday, the day before Labor Day, Mary and I attended a service at the John Coltrane Church. There were paintings and murals of Coltrane everywhere. In all of them, he looked wise and serene. During the service, people sang in unison to his music. It was pretty beautiful. Mary and I wound up living together at my new place for a month or two. As for the case of the missing automobile, the San Francisco PD wasn't much help. Meanwhile, on the 4th floor of the Clock Tower building, someone from a nearby cubicle was promoted to floor supervisor. The coworker who had suggested legal action against Bank of America admitted that the idea was a bust. His partner, the lawyer, didn't think there was much of a case and wasn't willing to take it on. A week to the day I'd reported the car stolen, I came home to a message on my answering machine. It was a woman named Linda Hatch from a place in Texas I'd never heard of. The police, the message went, had given her my number, and could I call her back? She had information about my car. I dialed her up immediately, and Mrs. Hatch answered right away. She said that my car had been abandoned on her property, and described it as being in rough shape, only good for parts at this point. When I asked about Ken, she released a long, expressive sigh. I could almost see her standing there, shaking her head. Ken was your boss, right? At the bank? He was here for my daughter. That young man is no good. Linda Hatch explained that Ken had somehow gotten it into his head that Millie, her daughter, was having his child. That wasn't the case at all, Linda said. Millie wasn't pregnant now, nor had she ever been to her knowledge. Furthermore, Millie had little interest in speaking with Ken. Linda said Ken had only come by the one time, then stormed off on foot. And I don't reckon we'll be seeing him again, she said, now that the local police is involved. Not only was Ken on the hook for stealing my car, it turned out he was AWOL from the military. I took down Linda Hatch's address for the insurance claim. Linda said that she was awful sorry that I had gotten tangled up in this. She asked if there was anything more that she could do for me. I couldn't think of anything, but then she remembered the milk crate full of notebooks in the back of the car. I'll be glad to have it shipped to you, she said, and took down my address. The old notebooks arrived a couple weeks later via UPS, and the check from the insurance company came that day too. It was made out to me and exceeded $2,000. Owing to the age and structural damage to the car, they had classified it as totaled. I guess it's worth mentioning that I had approached Bank of America management about the issue. Had they heard anything? Shouldn't they do something? Ken had access to a lot of confidential information, but management was no help, and they didn't even want to discuss it. It's a tack I understand now, but didn't back then, and it left a bad taste in my mouth. Luckily, with the money from the insurance company, I knew I could quit Bank of America whenever I wanted, take my time finding a new job. And it didn't take long for conversations on the 4th floor to turn to other topics. Ken's disappearance remained a curiosity, but in the end, it was little more than one in a million random San Francisco stories.